I suppose even an ugly woman can be useful, Harlan Whitmore said the night before his wedding, and the men around him laughed like it was the cleanest joke ever told west of the Mississippi. The lantern light in the saloon threw long amber shadows across polished boots and oak tables, and outside, the wind rolled over the prairie in slow, patient waves, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant cattle pens stretching more than a mile beyond town. Harlan stood near the window, broad shoulders filling the frame, silver watch chain glinting against his vest, a man who owned more head of cattle than most counties could count without removing their boots. He was 45, widowed, disciplined, and certain that life was nothing more than acreage measured, contracts signed, and names added to deeds. Tomorrow, he would marry Eleanor Hayes, a woman the town called plain in lowered voices and unkind tones, a woman who kept her chin tucked and her gloves on even in July heat that climbed past 90 degrees. The marriage had been arranged with the quiet efficiency of a land transfer, because that was what it was to Harlan. A final signature on a disputed strip of property that ran along the north pasture, 200 acres that meant the difference between expansion and limitation. He had told himself it was practical. He had told himself she would be grateful. In the far corner of the saloon, a ranch hand muttered that love had nothing to do with it, and Harlan did not bother to disagree. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, boots striking wood with steady rhythm, and looked down Main Street where the small white church stood against the darkening sky. Tomorrow that door would open for him again, but not for grief this time for advantage. Eleanor Hayes, meanwhile, sat in a modest house at the edge of town, lamplight pooling over a worn wooden table where a stack of folded documents rested beneath her steady hands. She did not cry. She did not pace. She listened to the night insects humming beyond the open window and to the quiet certainty in her own breathing. The town believed she was fortunate. They believed Harlan Whitmore had chosen her out of generosity, that a cattle baron marrying a woman like Eleanor was an act of charity disguised as matrimony. They did not know that her late father's signature lay inked on papers older than some of the buildings in town, nor did they know that Eleanor could recite the boundaries of Whitmore land in miles and fence posts without once glancing at a map. Back at his ranch, Harlan walked the perimeter of his largest pasture before turning in, boots pressing into dirt that had answered to his name for years. He imagined a quiet wife, a silent table, a life undisturbed by argument. He imagined control. The prairie wind shifted, cooler now, brushing against the collar of his coat, as if carrying a warning he was too confident to hear. By sunrise, the church bell would ring, and Harlan Whitmore would stand before the town believing he was taking possession of something small and manageable. He did not yet understand that by the time the sun set beyond those endless western fields, it would be his certainty, not Eleanor Hayes, that would look different in the fading light. The morning of the wedding arrived with a sky the color of pale steel and a wind that carried dust in thin ribbons across Main Street. Harlan Whitmore rose before dawn as he always did, standing on the porch of his ranch house with a tin cup of black coffee warming his hands while the eastern horizon brightened inch by inch over 3 miles of fenced pasture. The cattle were already moving in slow dark clusters, their low calls drifting across the land like a steady reminder that ownership required vigilance. He liked that sound. It was honest, predictable, unlike people. By 8 o'clock he was dressed in a dark wool suit that fit his broad frame with the clean severity of a man who did not waste fabric or words. His boots were polished, his collar stiff, his expression unreadable. The hired men lined up awkwardly near the barn, hats in hand, unsure whether to offer congratulations or silence. Harlan gave them a short nod that meant both and neither. The ride into town took 20 minutes at an unhurried pace, the horses' hooves striking the packed dirt road with steady rhythm. As he passed the north pasture, he glanced at the disputed boundary line, a stretch of fence posts running crooked for nearly half a mile where Whitmore land met Hayes land. Soon, he believed, that crookedness would disappear. In town, the church bell rang once, then again, each toll echoing against storefront windows and drawing curious faces to the boardwalk. Women adjusted gloves. Men leaned against hitching rails, whispering. Eleanor Hayes arrived not in a carriage but in her aunt's modest wagon, the wheels creaking softly as it stopped near the church steps. She stepped down carefully, wearing a simple ivory dress that fell straight to her boots. No lace, no embroidery, only clean lines and careful stitching. A hat with a narrow brim shaded her face, and for a moment she stood still, hands folded at her waist, as if measuring the air. There were no giggles from her, no visible nerves, only composure. Harlan watched from the church doorway, noting the absence of spectacle, the absence of vanity. He mistook it for resignation. Inside, the church smelled faintly of pine boards and candle wax. Sunlight slipped through narrow windows, laying bright stripes across the aisle. The ceremony was brief, the pastor's voice steady and formal, speaking of duty, partnership, and covenant. Harlan answered clearly when asked, his voice deep and unwavering. Eleanor answered just as clearly, her tone even, neither eager nor reluctant. When the rings were exchanged, her gloved fingers did not tremble. Outside, a breeze caught the hem of her dress as they stepped into the daylight as husband and wife. A few claps rose from the crowd, polite but thin. Harlan placed his hand at the small of her back out of habit rather than affection, guiding her toward the waiting horse and wagon that would take them to his ranch. As they began the ride across open prairie, the town shrinking behind them, silence settled between them like a third passenger. Harlan assumed it was shyness. Eleanor looked ahead at the long road cutting through grass that stretched for miles, her gaze steady, as though she were not entering a new life, but returning to unfinished business. The wagon wheels rolled over the last rise before Whitmore land came fully into view, and the ranch house stood against the open sky, like something built to outlast weather and regret. It was larger than any home Eleanor had lived in, 2 stories of sun-faded wood with wide porches and tall windows that caught the late afternoon light. The barn stretched nearly 100 feet behind it, painted red once, but now weathered into a muted rust. Corrals lined the yard in careful geometry, and beyond them the cattle moved in slow currents across fields that ran farther than the eye could follow. Harlan stepped down first when the wagon stopped, boots landing firm in the dirt as though claiming the ground all over again. He turned and offered his hand to Eleanor with measured politeness. She accepted, her gloved fingers resting lightly in his palm, and descended without hesitation. The hired men pretended to busy themselves with tack and reins, though their eyes lifted in brief, curious glances. They had expected awkwardness, perhaps tears, perhaps uncertainty. They saw none. Inside the house, the air held the faint scent of cedar and old paper. The floors were wide planks, worn smooth by years of measured footsteps. A long dining table stood in the center room, polished to a soft shine, set for 2 though no meal waited upon it. Harlan removed his coat and placed it carefully over the back of a chair. He gestured toward the staircase that curved along the wall. "Your room is prepared," he said, his voice steady, as though assigning quarters to a guest rather than welcoming a wife. Eleanor's gaze traveled slowly across the room, not with awe, not with envy, but with attention. She noticed the framed land survey maps hanging near the fireplace, the inked lines marking boundaries in precise squares and rectangles. She noticed the locked cabinet beside the desk, the brass key still in place. She noticed how the north-facing windows aligned with the disputed fence line beyond the fields. Harlan spoke of practical matters, of schedules and accounts, of how breakfast was served at 6 and how the ranch ledger was updated every Sunday evening without fail. He expected compliance. He expected gratitude. Eleanor removed her hat and set it gently on the entry table, revealing hair pinned simply at the nape of her neck. There was no flourish in her movements, only calm economy. When she spoke, it was not to question but to clarify. "I would like to review the ranch books this evening," she said, her tone level. Harlan paused, faint surprise crossing his features before composure returned. "The books are complex," he replied. She met his eyes without challenge. So is land. A quiet settled between them, not tense, not warm, but observant. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing against the house. In a low murmur, as if listening, Harlan had imagined bringing home a silent figure who would move like furniture within his walls. Instead, as Eleanor stepped toward the desk and rested her gloved hand lightly on the closed ledger, he felt the first small tremor in a certainty he had carried for years, though he could not yet name it. Harlan moved to the desk slowly. as if approaching something that had shifted in his absence, and drew the ledger toward him before opening it with deliberate care. The pages were thick, cream-colored, filled with rows of numbers written in his firm, disciplined hand. Feed costs measured in dollars and cents, cattle counts listed in the hundreds, rainfall recorded in inches each season. It was a record of control, of order imposed on open land. Eleanor stepped closer, removing her gloves finger by finger, folding them neatly, then resting her bare hands on the edge of the desk. The late afternoon sun slanted through the north window, lighting the ink on the page and casting a pale line across her face. Harlan expected confusion. Instead, she leaned in slightly and began to read, her eyes moving steadily across columns and margins. After a moment she spoke, not loudly, not sharply, simply as one states a fact. "The North pasture has been underperforming for 3 seasons," she said. Harlan did not look up at first. "Drought," he answered. "It happens." Eleanor tilted her head, gazed still on the figures. Rainfall last spring measured 23 inches. The year before it was 25. Those are not drought numbers. Her tone held no accusation, only arithmetic. Harlan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned another page, as if the motion itself might dismiss her observation. She continued, her finger tracing a line of ink. "You increased feed shipments by 12%, yet cattle weight at market dropped by 8. That suggests not weather, but boundary miscalculation." The word lingered in the air like dust suspended in sunlight. Boundary. Harlan finally looked at her fully. "The north fence is where it has always been," he said. His voice remained calm, but a faint edge pressed against the words. Eleanor met his gaze without challenge. Where it has always been does not mean where it should be. Silence settled between them again, heavier now. Outside, a loose shutter tapped softly against the siding. In the wind, an irregular rhythm that seemed to mark time. Harlan closed the ledger halfway, as though to reduce its authority. "Those matters are handled," he said. "I have overseen this ranch for 20 years. Eleanor nodded once, acknowledging the truth of that statement without surrendering her own. "And in those 20 years, she replied gently, "the fence line has remained 3 feet south of the original survey markers filed in county records. 3 feet along half a mile equals nearly 1 acre. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Harlan stared at her, calculation moving behind his eyes. An acre was not ruin. It was not disaster. But it was proof. She stepped back slightly, giving him space not out of submission but respect. "I did not come here unaware," she said quietly. The room felt smaller somehow, though nothing had moved. The house that had always echoed with certainty now held a new presence, one that measured rather than assumed. Harlan straightened, folding the ledger closed with care. He had expected to instruct. Instead, he found himself listening. The wind pressed against the north window again, and for the first time he wondered whether the line he trusted most had never truly belonged to him. Harlan did not speak for a long moment after she finished, and the quiet inside the house felt different now, no longer empty, but waiting. He moved past her toward the north window and looked out across the stretch of pasture where the fence posts ran in a thin, almost careless line against the horizon. From this distance, 3 feet meant nothing. It vanished in open space. It disappeared beneath wind and grass and the broad sweep of sky. But he knew land did not measure itself by distance alone. It measured itself by paper, by ink, by who held the record. He turned back slowly. "You have been studying county filings," he said, not as an accusation, but as recognition. Eleanor folded her gloves once more and placed them neatly beside the ledger. "My father kept copies," she replied. "After he passed, I kept reading." Her voice carried neither resentment nor pride, only continuity. Harlan walked to the cabinet by the fireplace and removed a small brass key, unlocking the drawer where older surveys were stored. The papers inside were brittle at the edges, some dated more than 20 years back. He spread them across the desk, the parchment whispering as it moved. Eleanor stepped forward, not touching at first, simply observing. The original survey markers were placed at the cottonwood near the creek bend, she said quietly, pointing to a faded notation. Harlan followed her gesture. The cottonwood had fallen in a storm 15 years ago. He remembered the sound of it splitting in the night. He had ordered the fence rebuilt soon after. He had trusted the placement, trusted the men, trusted his own certainty. The replacement posts had been driven into the ground without malice, but also without cross-reference. 3 feet south. Enough to shift a line. Enough to change a ledger. Harlan exhaled slowly, the sound low in his chest. Why mention it now, he asked. The question was steady, but beneath it lay something unfamiliar. Eleanor finally met his eyes fully. Because now the line belongs to both of us, she answered. The words settled heavier than accusation would have. Not you. Not me. Us. Outside. The sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the north pasture, as if emphasizing every boundary. Harlan felt a strange tightening in his chest. Not anger, not fear, but awareness. He had entered this marriage believing he was acquiring quiet compliance in exchange for security. Instead, he had gained a witness. Someone who saw not only the numbers, but the spaces between them. Eleanor gathered the older surveys carefully and stacked them with precision. I am not here to take from you, she said after a moment. I am here to correct what drifted. The distinction mattered. Harlan looked once more at the north line, then back at the woman standing in his study with calm resolve. For the first time since the church bell rang that morning, he understood that this union was not a transaction sealed at an altar. It was a reckoning unfolding in daylight, measured not in acres alone, but in honesty. And honesty, he was beginning to realize, weighed more than land. Evening settled across the ranch in long bands of copper light, and the north pasture glowed beneath a sky slowly turning violet at the edges. Harlan stood on the porch with his hands resting on the railing, the wood worn smooth by years of solitary reflection. He had always measured problems in practical terms, in dollars, in acreage, in head of cattle counted twice before market. Yet what lingered now was not numerical. It was the steady tone of Eleanor's voice, the quiet certainty with which she had spoken of drifted lines and shared ownership. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of pages turning. She had returned to the desk, reviewing the older surveys under lamplight, not with suspicion, but with care. The ranch house no longer felt like a fortress of one will. It felt like a place under examination. After several minutes, Harlan stepped down from the porch and walked toward the barn. The scent of hay and leather met him as he entered, familiar and grounding. He paused near the tack wall where tools hung in ordered rows, then selected a measuring chain coiled on a peg. It was an old instrument, 50 feet long, marked in brass intervals. He had not used it personally in years. The ranch hands usually handled such tasks. Tonight, he carried it himself. Eleanor noticed when he returned, the chain draped over his arm. Her eyes lifted from the documents, searching his expression. We will walk the line at first light, he said simply, not as a command, as a decision. She closed the survey papers carefully and nodded once. At dawn, the air was cool and clean, the grass damp beneath their boots as they set out toward the north pasture. No ranch hands followed. No witnesses. Just the two of them and a thin gray horizon. The fence posts stood spaced at regular intervals, stretching nearly half a mile toward the creek bend. Harlan uncoiled the chain and handed one end to Eleanor. She took it without hesitation. They worked in silence, measuring from marker to marker, aligning the brass intervals with the faded notations from the original survey. 50 feet, 100, 200. The numbers accumulated steadily, each length of chain revealing small discrepancies that seemed insignificant alone but undeniable together. 3 feet south. Consistent. Precise. Harlan crouched near one post, pressing his palm against the soil as if the earth itself might argue. It did not. The land accepted measurement without emotion. When they reached the final marker near where the old cottonwood once stood, Harlan remained standing for a long moment, eyes tracing the invisible line where the boundary should have been. Eleanor waited, offering no pressure. The morning sun rose higher, warming the field, illuminating dust that shimmered briefly in the air before settling again. Finally, Harlan spoke, his voice lower than usual. The fence will be moved. The words were not loud, yet they carried weight across the open ground. Eleanor did not smile. She did not claim victory. She simply inclined her head in acknowledgement. In that quiet pasture, with no one watching and no applause to earn, Harlan Whitmore understood that authority did not diminish when corrected. It deepened, and beside him stood the woman he had once underestimated, steady as the land itself, measuring not just acreage but character. By mid-morning, the decision had turned into action, and the sound of post drivers and steady hammering carried across the north pasture like a slow drumbeat of correction. Harlan had gathered 3 of his most trusted ranch hands, men who had ridden with him through drought and flood, men who rarely questioned his word. Today, however, his instructions surprised them. "Move the fence 3 feet north along the entire stretch," he said evenly, pointing toward the line they had measured at dawn. One of the men glanced at the others, confusion flickering across his sunburned face. "That will give up near an acre, sir," he replied carefully. Harlan did not raise his voice. "It was never ours to keep," he answered. The words settled into the open air with quiet authority. Eleanor stood a few yards away, skirts brushing the tall grass, observing without interference. She did not supervise. She did not correct. She simply watched the alignment of each new post as it was driven into the soil. The prairie wind moved through the field in low waves, carrying the scent of earth freshly turned where old posts had been removed and new ones set. The work was not dramatic. It was deliberate. 50 feet at a time, the boundary shifted back to where the original survey had marked it decades before. Harlan worked alongside his men for part of the morning, sleeves rolled, hands steady as he held a post upright, while another secured it. There was no grand speech, no explanation offered beyond the initial order. Yet the ranch hands began to understand that something larger than acreage was being measured. By noon, the line looked straighter, truer, as if the land itself had exhaled. Eleanor approached once the final length of wire had been tightened. She walked the adjusted boundary slowly, her boots pressing into soil that now belonged where it always should have. Harlan joined her, stopping near the creek bend where the old cottonwood stump still lay weathered and gray. The tree had fallen years ago, but its roots remained deep in the ground. "This is where it began to drift," she said softly, resting her hand on the rough wood. Harlan nodded. "Drift happens when no one checks the markers," he replied. His voice carried reflection rather than defense. She looked out over the pasture, sunlight catching the surface of the creek in a thin silver line. "I did not ask you to move it for me," she said after a moment. "I asked because it was right." Harlan understood the distinction. He had given land back not to win favor, not to quiet gossip, but because truth required it. The ranch hands began riding back toward the barn, their figures shrinking against the wide sky. Harlan remained by the creek, boots planted firmly in soil that now lay exactly where the record intended. For years he had believed strength meant holding ground without question. Standing beside Eleanor in the clear noon light, he realized strength could also mean adjusting a line without being forced. The fence no longer leaned south. It stood straight. And so, quietly did he. Word of the adjusted fence line traveled to town before the dust from the post holes had fully settled. By late afternoon, a rider from the general store passed along the north road, slowing just enough to take in the sight of the straightened boundary, the fresh wood pale against the darker weathered posts. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No sign announced it. Yet in small towns, land shifts louder than thunder. The following Sunday, Harlan and Eleanor rode into town together in a simple wagon, the same quiet pace as before, but something unspoken had altered between them. Main Street looked the same as it always had, boardwalk planks creaking beneath boots, the church bell hanging motionless above the door, dust lifting in soft spirals where horses stamped. A few men who had laughed days earlier now stood with their hats held lower, their eyes studying Harlan with cautious curiosity. He did not address them. He did not explain. He stepped down from the wagon and offered Eleanor his hand, not out of obligation, but recognition. She accepted with the same calm steadiness she had shown since the first evening in his study. Inside the church, the light filtered through narrow windows, laying pale ribbons across the wooden pews. They took their seats without ceremony. During the closing hymn, an older rancher leaned toward Harlan and murmured that he had heard about the fence. "That is a generous correction," the man said quietly. Harlan kept his gaze forward. "It is an accurate one," he replied. The distinction lingered in the air longer than the hymn itself. Outside, near the hitching rail, another man approached Eleanor while Harlan secured the reins. "I did not know your father kept such precise records," he said, not unkindly. Eleanor's expression remained composed. "He believed lines should be honored," she answered. The wind lifted the edge of her sleeve gently, then settled again. No one pressed further. No one mocked. There was a subtle recalibration in the way the town looked at them, not admiration exactly, but respect edged with thoughtfulness. On the ride back to the ranch, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the prairie, turning the grass into bands of gold and muted green. Harlan held the reins loosely, the rhythm of the horse steady and even. After a mile of silence, he spoke without turning his head. "They laughed at you in that saloon," he said. Eleanor watched the horizon ahead. "I heard," she replied. He nodded once, absorbing the simplicity of her answer. "I believed them," he admitted after another stretch of road. The confession was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. Eleanor did not rush to soften it. "Belief can drift like a fence," she said gently. "It only takes a few feet to change what belongs where." The wagon rolled forward, wheels tracing familiar tracks across open land that now felt subtly different, not because of acreage gained or lost, but because something invisible had been set straight. And in the fading light, side by side beneath a wide western sky, they rode not as transaction and correction, but as two figures aligned by a boundary neither of them intended to let drift again. The days that followed did not erupt into spectacle. They settled instead into a new rhythm measured in small adjustments and steady observation. Harlan began rising earlier than before, not out of restlessness but intention, stepping onto the porch as the first gray light stretched across the prairie and glancing instinctively toward the north line. The fence stood firm and straight, each post catching the dawn like a quiet testament. Eleanor joined him some mornings, shawl wrapped lightly around her shoulders against the cool air, her gaze traveling the same horizon without comment. They did not speak much in those early hours. They did not need to. The ranch hands worked differently now, though none would have admitted it. Measurements were checked twice. Feed tallies were verified against actual weight at market. Small discrepancies that once might have been dismissed as rounding errors were examined with care. Harlan noticed this shift and understood that authority, when aligned with fairness, did not weaken discipline. It sharpened it. One afternoon, as he reviewed market receipts at the desk, Eleanor approached with a folded letter bearing the county seal. She laid it beside him without flourish. "The revised boundary filing has been recorded," she said. He opened the letter and read the confirmation, ink crisp and official. 3 feet north. Accurate. Final. He felt an unexpected steadiness settle in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but clarity. Later that week, a neighboring rancher rode over, hat tipped low against the sun, asking quietly about the adjustment. Harlan explained in plain terms, offering no excuses. The original survey markers had been misaligned after the cottonwood fell, he said. "We corrected it." The neighbor studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "That is rare," he replied simply. The word rare lingered long after the rider had left. That evening, Eleanor stood by the kitchen table reviewing inventory lists, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Harlan watched her from the doorway, recognizing the same composure he had once mistaken for weakness. "You knew before the wedding," he said at last. She did not look up immediately. "I suspected," she answered. "I confirmed after." He stepped into the room, boots quiet against the wooden floor. "Why marry into it, then?" Eleanor set the pencil down and met his eyes fully. "Because correcting from within is sometimes steadier than fighting from outside." There was no triumph in her tone, only reasoning. Harlan considered the weight of that. She had not come to claim land through accusation. She had chosen alignment over confrontation. Outside, the prairie wind moved across the fields in long, patient waves, bending grass without breaking it. Harlan realized that strength did not always announce itself in raised voices or firm commands. Sometimes it arrived in the form of calm persistence, measured in feet and inches, in documents filed and fences moved. And as the sun lowered beyond the straightened boundary line, he understood that the true shift had not been 3 feet of pasture. It had been the quiet repositioning of his own certainty, adjusted not by force, but by a woman who refused to let the line drift unnoticed. Autumn arrived without announcement, slipping over the prairie in cooler mornings and longer shadows that stretched thin across the straightened fence line. The grass shifted from deep green to muted gold, and the cattle moved more slowly, thickening with the season as market time approached. Harlan found himself walking the ranch in the evenings rather than merely surveying it from the porch. He paused at gates, checked latches with his own hands, and traced the north boundary with his eyes as if it were a quiet reminder rather than a correction. Eleanor often accompanied him, her steps measured, skirts brushing softly against dry grass that whispered underfoot. They spoke of practical matters at first, of feed ratios and winter storage, of the barn roof that would need reinforcement before the first hard frost. Yet beneath those discussions lay something steadier, an understanding forged not in ceremony, but in adjustment. One evening, as the sun lowered in a wide arc of amber light, Harlan stopped near the creek bend where the old cottonwood stump still rested like a weathered monument. He had ordered a young sapling planted beside it earlier that week, a small tree no taller than his shoulder, its leaves trembling in the faint wind. Eleanor noticed it immediately. "You replace what fell?" she said quietly. Harlan nodded once. "Lines drift when markers disappear," he replied. "I do not intend to let that happen again." The sapling stood thin but upright, roots pressing into soil that had once witnessed misalignment. It was not a grand gesture. It was a commitment measured in years rather than acres. As they walked back toward the house, lantern light flickered from the windows, casting a warm glow across the yard. Inside, the long dining table no longer felt like a symbol of arrangement. It held shared ledgers, revised figures, and notes written in both their hands. That night, after the ranch hands had retired and the wind had quieted to a low murmur against the siding, Harlan remained seated at the desk with a blank sheet of paper before him. He dipped his pen in ink and began drafting a formal statement to the county clerk, not required by law, but necessary in his mind. The correction of the north boundary had been made voluntarily and with acknowledgement of original survey records. He signed it with steady script, then slid the paper toward Eleanor. She read it slowly, her expression calm. "This was not demanded of you," she said. "No," he answered. "It was not." He folded the document carefully, sealing it with wax. In the quiet of that room, beneath lamplight and the faint scent of cedar, he understood that authority earned through fairness endured longer than authority defended through pride. Outside, the prairie lay vast and patient beneath a sky thick with early stars. The fence stood straight. The sapling held firm in new soil. And within the walls of the ranch house, something equally important had been set upright, not by force, not by humiliation, but by the steady alignment of two wills choosing accuracy over arrogance. Winter pressed in slowly, not with sudden storms, but with a steady tightening of air that turned breath visible at dawn and left frost clinging to fence wire like thin silver thread. The sapling by the creek bend had shed its leaves, standing bare, yet upright against a pale sky that carried the promise of snow. Harlan rode the north boundary one quiet morning, reins loose in his gloved hands, eyes tracing the straight line that now cut clean across the pasture. The adjustment had settled into the rhythm of the ranch. No one questioned it anymore. It simply was. And yet, within him, something continued to shift, deeper than land, quieter than wind. That afternoon, a small gathering took place at the general store, ranchers speaking in low voices about market routes and rail expansions coming from the east. Harlan listened, offering measured opinions, his presence steady as always. But when one man remarked that keeping advantage was the only way to survive in open country, Harlan did not agree as he once would have. "Survival is not the same as fairness," he said calmly. The conversation paused, not in confrontation, but in reconsideration. He did not elaborate. He did not defend the statement. He simply let it stand. Later, back at the ranch, Eleanor was in the study reviewing winter supply lists, her handwriting neat and deliberate across the page. Harlan removed his coat and stood near the desk for a moment before speaking. "I have been thinking about the remaining acreage along the creek," he said. "It borders the Hayes parcel more naturally than ours." Eleanor looked up, attentive but not expectant. He continued, choosing his words with care. "When my father expanded this ranch, he did so quickly. Too quickly. Some of those agreements were lawful. Some were merely convenient." The air in the room grew still. Eleanor closed the ledger slowly. "You are not responsible for every decision made before you," she said. Harlan met her gaze. "Perhaps not, but I am responsible for what I continue." The statement carried no dramatics, only clarity. He explained that he intended to review the older acquisition records to ensure no other lines had drifted under the weight of assumption. Eleanor studied him quietly, recognizing the gravity of what he was choosing. This was no longer about 3 feet of fence. It was about a standard. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the siding, and snow clouds gathered in slow formation across the western sky. Harlan stepped toward the window, looking out over land that had once represented unchallenged authority. It now represented stewardship. I believed strength meant holding every inch, he said softly. Eleanor joined him at the window, her reflection faint in the glass beside his. Strength also means knowing which inches were never meant to be yours, she replied. He nodded once, accepting the truth without resistance. As the first thin flakes of snow began to fall, settling gently across pasture and roof alike, Harlan Whitmore understood that legacy was not measured solely in acres owned, but in lines corrected, in decisions made quietly, and in the willingness to stand beneath an open sky and choose accuracy over pride. The snow settled deeper as December moved across the plains, softening fence lines and rounding the edges of posts that had once stood sharp against autumn light. The sapling by the creek bend now held a thin coat of white along its bare branches, bending slightly beneath the quiet weight, yet refusing to bow. Inside the ranch house, the fire in the hearth burned low and steady, casting warm light across the study where old acquisition records lay spread across the desk in careful stacks. Harlan had spent weeks reviewing them, page by brittle page, tracing signatures, dates, and survey marks that reached back more than 20 years. Some agreements were clear and clean. Others carried the faint smell of haste, lines drawn quickly to secure advantage before neighboring families could fully understand what they were yielding. Eleanor sat across from him, not instructing, not accusing, simply present as he worked. The scratching of his pen against paper marked corrections in the margins, notes to revisit certain parcels once the roads cleared in spring. One evening, after sealing another envelope addressed to the county clerk, Harlan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. There are 2 more tracks along the eastern ridge that require adjustment, he said, his voice measured. Eleanor folded her hands atop a stack of ledgers. Will you wait until someone demands it? She asked quietly. He shook his head. No, it will be done before the thaw. The statement carried no hesitation. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the windows, carrying snow across the yard in thin drifting lines that erased footprints by morning. Word of his earlier correction had already shifted the tone in town. Now, as rumors of further reviews circulated, some ranchers watched with skepticism, others with reluctant respect. Harlan understood both reactions. He had once believed that holding ground defined a man. Now he understood that tending ground defined him better. On a clear afternoon when the clouds finally parted, he and Eleanor rode toward the eastern ridge, snow crunching beneath the horses' hooves, breath rising in pale clouds before them. The ridge overlooked nearly 500 acres of rolling pasture, land his father had once described as the future of the Whitmore name. Harlan dismounted and stood in silence, scanning the horizon. The view was wide and commanding, but it no longer stirred ambition alone. It stirred responsibility. He removed a folded survey from his coat and handed it to Eleanor. The boundary line had been drawn generously toward his side decades ago, nudged by convenience rather than strict measurement. In spring, he would realign it, not because it would be noticed, not because it would earn praise, but because accuracy, once recognized, could not be ignored. Eleanor studied the document, then looked out across the snow-covered ridge. You are choosing a quieter legacy, she said. Harlan nodded slowly. Quieter lasts longer, he replied. The wind moved gently across the ridge, lifting fine crystals of snow that shimmered briefly in the afternoon light before settling again. And there, beneath a vast winter sky, the measure of the ranch shifted once more, not in acres surrendered, but in character strengthened, steady as the land beneath their boots. Spring arrived with the slow certainty of thawing ground, snow retreating into shallow streams that traced silver lines across the eastern ridge. The sapling by the creek bend held small green buds now, fragile yet determined, its roots anchored where an old mistake had once taken hold. Harlan stood beside it at sunrise, hat in hand, watching light spill across pasture that no longer felt like a possession to defend but a trust to maintain. The fence lines lay straight against the horizon, each post set with intention rather than habit. Behind him, the ranch house breathed quietly in the morning air, smoke rising thin and steady from the chimney. Eleanor stepped onto the porch and paused, observing him from a distance before walking down the worn path toward the creek. Her boots pressed into softened earth, leaving clear prints that would remain until the wind chose to erase them. They did not speak at first. The silence between them no longer held tension or calculation. It held understanding. Harlan broke it gently. "The eastern ridge will be adjusted this week," he said. "The papers are prepared." Eleanor nodded once, not surprised, not triumphant. "You have already moved the most important line," she replied. He looked at her, a question in his eyes that no longer feared answer. "The one inside," she clarified softly. He considered that as the sun climbed higher, warming the pasture in gradual degrees. In town, men still talked of acreage and profit and expansion. Some would never shift their fences. Some would. But here, along the creek where the old cottonwood stump rested beside a growing tree, a different measure had taken root. Later that afternoon, Harlan rode into town alone, documents secured in his saddlebag. He entered the county office without announcement and placed the revised surveys on the clerk's desk. No speech accompanied them. No justification. Only inked lines corrected and signed. As he stepped back onto Main Street, the bell above the door chimed softly, and a few familiar faces glanced his way. There was no laughter now, no whisper sharp enough to wound, just quiet acknowledgement. When he returned to the ranch, Eleanor stood at the north boundary, watching the cattle graze along a line that no longer drifted. He dismounted and joined her, their shoulders nearly aligned as they faced the open field. "I was wrong," he said at last, the words simple and unadorned. Not forced, not theatrical. True. Eleanor did not answer immediately. She let the wind carry the statement across the grass, let it settle into soil that had already witnessed change. Then she inclined her head slightly, accepting the truth without need for further ceremony. The prairie stretched wide before them, miles of earth under a sky that judged nothing and remembered everything. Out here, justice had not arrived with raised voices or public display. It had come quietly, measured in feet and inches, in signatures and straightened posts, in a man choosing accuracy over arrogance. And as the sun lowered beyond the aligned fence line, casting long gold light across land held not by pride, but by integrity, Harlan Whitmore understood that legacy was not the size of a ranch. It was the steadiness of a boundary kept honest. The wind moved gently through the grass, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because nothing more needed to be said.